One bright sunny day, the man gently asked his daughter if she remembered the Duke Taylor oath from their previous lesson, as he considered these words to be the basis of honor and duty for a future ruler. Grace herself was bright and warm, like the morning sun over golden fields of wheat, and replied that the main rule of their house was that no one in the subject lands should ever go hungry. Upon hearing the correct answer, the man joyfully picked up his daughter and began to circle with her, as if celebrating her wisdom, and at the same time proud of having raised such a kind and attentive child. As he wrapped his daughter around him, he pointed out the vast expanses and explained that one day these lands would become her responsibility. But for that to happen, she had to learn to care for people and fulfill her duties honestly. Grace listened to her father with admiration, looking at him with big, trusting eyes, completely unaware that fate was already preparing her difficult trials that would change her life forever. After a terrible fire that swept through all the estates and left behind only ashes and ruins, the villagers were deeply saddened and confused, having lost their homes, livestock, and hope for a peaceful future. Many years have passed since those events, and during this time, almost everything has changed, from the appearance of the lands to the moods of people, who now look at the world much more gloomily than before. Grace had long since grown up and turned into a beautiful young woman who had retained her natural tenderness, but at the same time had acquired the restraint and cold dignity inherent in those who had survived losses. Every time she approached the window, she was greeted by the sad faces of her subordinates, and not wanting to look at their pain and hopelessness, she quickly pulled back the heavy curtains as if trying to shield herself from reality. Turning to the desk, where numerous papers and open books lay haphazardly, Grace felt tired from the endless chores that brought neither relief to people nor peace to her own heart. The girl carefully touched the thin fabric with the embroidered coat of arms that lay next to the documents, running her fingers over the soft surface, as if trying to calm herself or find some support in this cold office. Suddenly, the door flew open, and a terrified maid ran into Milady's room, panting from haste and fear, her hands shaking, and panic in her eyes. She hurriedly broke the terrible news that a serious incident had occurred in the house, which could lead to dangerous consequences for the entire family and their situation. And unfortunately, it turned out to be true, that the young count made indecent proposals to his personal maid Grace. Meanwhile, the man began to rudely reprimand the girl for not following proper etiquette and not kneeling next to him. Falling to his knees, the man begged for forgiveness and tried to explain her behavior, but the owner only looked at them coldly. However, his words did not calm him down, but rather angered the man even more, and he sharply ordered him to be silent and not to dare speak without permission, demonstrating complete authority over his subordinates. The servants had no choice but to endure humiliation and be taught that their only purpose was to serve and submit unquestioningly to their masters. No one knew how it would all end and what punishment awaited those present if Grace had not intervened in time, whose appearance changed the tense atmosphere in the room. Trying not to provoke a conflict and speaking as calmly as possible, she reminded her husband that it was late and he should rest, hinting at the need to end this unpleasant scene. The workers looked at Milady with fear in their eyes, because they understood that her intervention could arouse the master's anger, and they were worried about her no less than about their own fate. The man was surprised by the girl's appearance and immediately assumed that she was Grace Taylor herself, the heiress of these lands, about whom he had heard many conflicting rumors. Assessing her from head to toe, he cynically thought that such a woman could be worth a lot of money, and a cold calculation appeared in his eyes. As it turned out, it was his future bride, who rarely appeared in public and almost never showed her face to strangers, so it was the first time he had seen her so close. The man confidently declared that servants must obey their masters without question, and added that he would only forgive the insult if she personally offered him a drink. At that moment, the servants were still kneeling, not daring to rise without permission, and if the man maintained apparent calm, the girl could barely contain her indignation. Grace calmly replied that the butler and Jessie should leave them alone so she could speak to the count properly, trying to remain polite despite his obvious disdain. After her order, those present quickly left the room, and their faces showed only relief and bitterness, as they had to witness a humiliating scene. After a while, only the girl and the man remained in the spacious room, separated by a few steps of tense silence. As soon as the door closed behind the last servant, the man immediately approached Grace almost face to face, violating the boundaries of decency. Without any permission, he touched her hair, looking at her as if she were not a living person, but a thing to be valued and appropriated. He mockingly remarked that he had no intention of marrying her at all in the first place, emphasizing his disdain. A few years ago, Grace would never have believed that she would allow someone to humiliate her so much, because she came from a noble family with large estates. At such moments, she especially missed her parents, the memories of whom always gripped her heart with pain and reminded her of the lost protection. She clearly remembers the day of their death and the funeral, when the world around her seemed cold and alien. After their deaths, many people showed their true faces, and the girl was left without support, deprived of lands, title, and influence. No one else hid their indifference to her, and no one showed genuine concern or compassion. She often missed her parents, and at the same time could not give a worthy rebuff to those who took advantage of her weakness. In difficult moments, Grace remembered the words of her father, who promised to always protect her from any adversity. And even now, during this unpleasant conversation, she turned to him again in her mind, seeking strength. Meanwhile, the man behaved defiantly, continuing to treat her as a toy that could be played with impunity. To his obscene words, the girl coldly replied that he was trying to raise his own price at the expense of someone else's humiliation. Indignant at such a frank answer, he began to mock her again, as if testing her patience. Grace added that his family agreed to cover the tailor's huge debts without any dowry just to get rid of him. Looking at the behavior of her future husband, Grace finally understood why her relatives wanted to marry him off as soon as possible. Jackson, not used to such audacity, was at first even confused and could not find the words to respond. When she reminded him of his unworthy behavior on the eve of the wedding, he only waved his hand in annoyance. However, this time he was unable to hit her because he lost his balance and staggered. Nearby lay a closed bottle of wine, which he clumsily stepped on and fell, finally losing his ostentatious grandeur. The girl calmly picked up the bottle, which miraculously did not break, and looked at him confidently, making it clear that she would not allow anyone to humiliate her again. She again mentally addressed her parents, saying that while she had lived in the shadows, holding her breath, she had been constantly sharpening her sword. Suddenly, a terrible thought flashed through the man's mind that she might unexpectedly hit him with that heavy bottle. However, Grace did not even intend to commit a crime, because all her life she had been silently and patiently training, sharpening her sword to get hers back. Finally, the moment had come to show her sword and demonstrate her power. So, swinging the bottle, she asked Jackson to grit his teeth as hard as he could. Seeing that the girl was determined and ruthless, the man tried to speak to her, but the words got stuck in his throat, and he couldn't utter a single one. So he just sat there, watching as the girl prepared to deliver a blow that seemed like it could be fatal. Meanwhile, guests finally arrived at the Taylor estate, adding an extra buzz to the previously quiet atmosphere of the palace. The host's assistant could not understand what was so important about this invitation, so he decided to come immediately after returning from the Wall of Death. Taking off his hood to examine the Taylor estate in more detail, he admitted that he was simply curious and wanted to check everything out with his own eyes. Having received the invitation, he decided to personally verify whether it was indeed genuine and whether there was any trickery or deception hidden behind these words. Duke Walter Richmond carefully read the invitation, which stated that the girl needed his presence at the wedding, and in exchange for this, he promised to give the sharpest sword that could protect his secret. Meanwhile, the argument between the future spouses continued, and suddenly the bottle fell to the floor again, causing a slight, alarming noise in the room. Grace watched the man's motionless body with a calm and cold expression, aware of her own power and control over the situation. She couldn't deny that reality always differs from expectations, and this moment became a vivid example of the fact that everything is not as simple as it seems. Meanwhile, other guests were preparing for the wedding, and one girl named Rosetta Taylor was showing off her new look in a festive dress to her mother, Madame Cornol. The senior maid immediately praised the girl, noting that she looked stunning in this dress and could not hide her admiration. To her mother's words that she was beautiful as always, the girl replied that today was a special day, and she wanted to personally congratulate Grace on the fact that she had officially been sold for debt. Despite the intemperate form of words, the mother agreed with her daughter, because after this wedding, they would no longer owe anything to the Jackson family and would be able to act at their own discretion. Eventually, they began to discuss finally getting the unpleasant Grace Taylor out of their palace, and they did so without any shame, even in the presence of the servants, which emphasized their determination. In addition, after the wedding, the girls' castle would officially pass into their possession, and they were eagerly awaiting this moment, imagining how their lives would change. Meanwhile, Grace herself was acting quite calm, despite the fact that her wedding was coming up soon, and she must have felt real excitement. The maids seemed to be more excited about her wedding than she was, and it showed in their every move and word. While putting on the veil, they reproached the girl for being too diligent and hardworking, despite the fact that the wedding day should be festive and easy. The maid wanted to add something more, but she didn't have time, as the arrival of the Duchess and Lady Rosetta was announced, which forced everyone to immediately stop discussing. Bowing her head in respect, Grace was a little surprised that her relatives had decided to come in person and pay her attention at such an important event. Holding a closed fan, she said that they had raised her as if she were their own daughter, and before the wedding, they decided to give her parting words that would remain in her memory forever. Touching Grace's porcelain face, she warned her not to create problems for their family, even if her husband showed aggression or brought strangers. She added that, despite what happened before, the girl has no right to complain to anyone, not even them, and wished her a happy life. Grace calmly listened to these words and assured her that she would definitely remember them and do everything to follow the advice. As she left her room, Rosetta told Grace to never return to the Taylor family palace again, leaving behind a sense of final farewell. Even the servants could not contain their emotions. They felt sorry for the lady, and they even cried, knowing that she would soon leave them and never return. As soon as the girl noticed the tears on the servants' faces, Grace forbade them to show their emotions, realizing that at the moment it could disrupt her plan. After all, if she shows even the slightest emotion now, her entire carefully thought-out plan will be instantly destroyed and rendered useless. The moment has not yet come when she can afford to cry, because she has not yet received the right to do so, and every action must be carefully controlled. After thanking them for everything they had done for her, the girl was finally about to set off for her fiancé, preparing for the remaining events that would determine her future. And finally, she said that this day would come when Grace would regain her rightful possessions, Taylor, and restore justice to her own hands. Meanwhile, all the guests were waiting for the bride, and they couldn't help but notice the bruise on the groom's face, who looked much more tired than usual. Rosetta laughed even more, as she had heard a lot of gossip about the groom and was delighted to see how unlucky Grace could be in choosing a companion. Meanwhile, Jackson's parents also noticed their son's appearance, and while the father remained indifferent, the mother could not hide her emotions, expressing concern. Jackson himself wanted to know what had happened to him, because he was so drunk that he didn't remember anything from the evening of the previous day, which made him worried. Finally, the bride entered the hall, so beautiful that all eyes were instantly focused only on her, and the rest of the guests forgot about their own affairs. As she walked down the aisle, she heard many words about how much she resembled her parents and how hard her life had been. Even when Grace approached Jackson, he couldn't take his eyes off her face and looked confused, much less utter a word. Joseph, struck by her beauty, could not help but notice the groom's reaction, which further emphasized the majesty of the moment and its significance for all present. Even the archbishop paid attention to the girl's appearance and briefly forgot about his role at the ceremony, as the bride's beauty and grace distracted him from his duties. Walter also looked at the girl, but with each glance he remembered her letter, sent earlier, which revealed her cunning and determination in achieving her goals. He couldn't believe that this fragile girl, who seemed so vulnerable and could break at any second, was also the sender of the invitation. Meanwhile, the ceremony had already begun, and when it was time to respond and take the oath, he agreed without hesitation, never taking his eyes off Grace. Immediately after that, the moment came when the girl had to answer the priest's questions, which required her complete concentration and calmness. At that moment, she remembered the words of her hated relative's wishes and decided to use them as a guideline to act carefully and without error. Afterwards, she recalled being praised for her excellent weapon skills, which immediately boosted her confidence and inspired her to take further action. It was then that she was taught that in order to always get the desired prey, she must appear weaker than she really is, so that the enemy relaxes. As soon as the opponent completely relaxes and is confident in his superiority, it is necessary to hit him in the weakest place, leaving no chance for resistance. Grace did just that when she refused to marry in front of everyone, declaring that her heart already belonged to another, and this surprised everyone present. At that moment, Walter realized that first impressions are often deceiving, and he liked Grace's bold and decisive behavior, which impressed him. When everyone finally realized what had happened, the relatives instantly rushed to catch up with the Count and Countess, hoping to rectify the situation in their favor. While Jackson himself did not yet understand what was happening, his parents began to shout and get angry, demanding an explanation for what they considered to be a vulgar bride. Fearing that their debts would remain unpaid, the girl's guardians tried to stop the Sachs family's carriage to prevent irreparable consequences. The man's anger knew no bounds, and he immediately began shouting the girl's name, not holding back his emotions and demanding immediate answers to his questions. Meanwhile, the girl left the palace, listening to threats that she would be struck out of the Taylor family, but she walked confidently and ignored them. As she walked by, Grace noticed Walter, but didn't recognize his face exactly, so she just walked by, not paying attention to him or drawing attention to her. While Walter watched after her, Joseph reported the latest news about Duke Taylor throwing himself directly under the Saxon carriage, which shocked him. The man did not respond to this information and ordered him to leave the palace, because if the girl promised to give him the sword, he was ready to take it immediately. Only at that moment did he realize that by this word she meant herself, which meant her willingness to personally protect his secret. He became very curious about how much Grace Taylor really knew about him and his plans, and he decided to watch her actions closely. Meanwhile, Grace Taylor moved slowly through the palace's secret room, carefully looking around to remain unnoticed and maintain her secret. Soon she noticed a maid in front of her who was discussing events related to Grace, and it seemed that she knew more than she needed to. Kneeling before the lady, Madame Cornul reported that all preparations were complete, and that the plan could now be carried out without delay. At this moment, Grace couldn't help but remember that the moment they had been waiting for together for 13 years had finally arrived, and her heart trembled with the memories. After all, it was then that a little girl, who had just lost her parents, first asked her for help, and this changed her entire future life. Despite her young age, Grace immediately realized that she needed to act, so she asked for help returning to the Taylor's apartment to find safety and support. Madame Cornul, putting a cloak on the girl, immediately explained current whereabouts of the man to whom Grace had personally sent an invitation to meet. Without wasting a minute, the girl immediately got into the carriage and set off for her destination with Jessica, realizing that any delay could be dangerous. During the journey, she remembered meeting a man with whom she had not even exchanged a word, but she immediately recognized him among the others, and this evoked strong emotions. His aura, even in the vast halls of Taylor Palace, covered everything around him, turning the majestic premises into a simple decoration, where he remained the center of attention. Holding the cloth in her hands, she had long known that this man was a vital element of revenge for her, and this determined all her further steps. The maid's information was confirmed, and after a while the men arrived at the place the woman had indicated, which showed the accuracy of her information and plans. Joseph couldn't help but notice that this place had been crowded with people in the morning, but now there was not a single soul here, and this surprised him and aroused suspicion. Walter didn't respond to his words, because he guessed that Grace already knew where he was, and now everything depended on her further actions. Therefore, as ridiculous as it may sound, Walter was forced to knock on the door, observing all the proper formalities, before entering his own room. Opening the door, he saw a calm girl sitting on a chair and looking out the window as if contemplating events of the past and the future. Meanwhile, the girl, holding the cloth in her hands, recalled events from 13 years ago when her life was still full of childhood worries and memories. She remembered the last night she saw her parents alive, and this memory enveloped her heart with warmth and sadness at the same time, reminding her of loss and responsibility. While the adults discussed that the Duke of Richmond and the Crown Prince had died in the crash, The girl listened attentively to their conversation, trying to understand the whole truth. The Duke said that Richmond had taken all measures in advance to protect the heir from the Empress, and therefore he assumed that the prince could still survive. However, at the time, it remained unknown whose body was actually identified and attributed to the prince, and this gave rise to numerous doubts and speculations among those around him. The husband, reassuring his wife, hinted that this was perhaps the body of the young Duke of Richmond, as the Duke and the Crown Prince were very similar in appearance and behavior. They would have continued discussing the situation if they hadn't heard their daughter's voice, who had already woken up and shown interest in what was happening around her. Grace, wiping her eye, asked if anything important had happened, and her words forced the parents to focus on their child's safety and peace of mind. Wrapping her arms around the girl, the mother apologized for waking her up and advised her to continue resting so the little one could recover. And the next moment, the carriage shook violently, and no one understood what had happened, but everyone felt the danger approaching from outside, and their hearts trembled with anxiety. Once everything had calmed down, Arthur asked Grace and Luciana if they were okay, and at the same time tried to understand the reason for the sudden shaking of the carriage. Having gone to see what exactly had happened, he left the girls alone in the carriage, as his attention was fully occupied with clarifying the situation and the safety of those around him. As soon as the man approached the groom, he asked why the carriage had stopped so suddenly and whether something had happened that threatened further movement or the lives of the passengers. Suddenly, he saw before him a weary knight of the Crown Prince, who was barely able to stand due to exhaustion and excessive fatigue from the journey. He was so tired that he couldn't even stand on his feet and immediately fell to his knees, demonstrating extreme weakness and the inability to continue moving without help. The only thing he managed to warn the man about was that he should be careful because the invisible ones were moving nearby and could pose a threat to everyone present. Handing him a cloth with the family crest, he asked him to take it and explained that this person was under the protection of the Dowager Duchess of Richmond, and this guaranteed her safety. Grace, who was nearby at her father's request, took the cloth and returned together to Taylor Palace, exercising caution and moving quickly forward. To reassure her daughter, the mother said that they would soon return to her, and Grace could feel some confidence in the safety and support of her family. And finally, Arthur asked Walter to take care of the girl so that no one would harm her. Grace felt something bad and therefore did not want to be separated from her parents, even for a moment. And at that very moment, they were engulfed in a terrible flame that spread extremely quickly around them. Soon the girl was standing at her parents' grave, holding delicate white lilies in her hands, not crying. Those present at the funeral discussed the strange death of the Taylor Dukes, whose carriage burned to the ground after the death of the Duke of Richmond. That same day, she received advice from a stranger who said she should live quietly to avoid her parents' fate. Returning to reality, she heard a man's voice saying that he knew her whereabouts here. Hiding the cloth so that no one would see it, the girl apologized for her impudence and impoliteness. Walter, having received a letter from her, decided to ask again if she would really give him a sword that would protect him. Confirming his own suspicions, he decided to find out what exactly the lady knew about him and his affairs. Grace immediately convinced him that she knew everything, addressing him respectfully as His Majesty. Despite controlling his emotions, this time he failed to remain calm, but he was able to pull himself together and said that it was complete nonsense. To confirm the words, Grace knelt down, showing her devotion and willingness to serve him. Then she showed a cloth with the family coat of arms, which she had received from him many years ago and had kept as a keepsake. Seeing this, the man had no doubt that she knew the truth about his life and family. She continued the story, telling how, during rumors of the death of the Crown Prince, she and her parents were traveling to the capital and encountered a wounded knight. The knight delivered a message to her parents, and she remembered his words even after many years. She noted that the real prince was under the protection of the Dowager Duchess of Richmond, and that only she knew about it. Grace continued that it was on that day that her parents turned to ashes, barely managing to protect her from danger. She invited him to take her in his hands as a sword of revenge and defeat all his enemies without pity. She promised to become his blade until he regained his throne and restored justice. Walter listened to her silently and noticed in her emerald eyes a cold and quiet anger that hid pain and determination. He realized how strong this girl was, who had burned all the bridges behind her, like a commander before a decisive battle. However, he decided to learn how he should use it as a sword to achieve his own goal. Grace smiled, realizing she had convinced him, and said that he just needed to show how much he loved her. She advised him to make her officially his lover, so that he could trust him completely and become his only ally. Walter was surprised by her request and didn't even know how to respond to such a frank offer. He asked again if she was suggesting that he become the same secret lover she had boldly declared at the altar today. Approaching the girl closer, he asked why they couldn't get married right away and strengthen their union. Grace explained that this was just a waste of time, and she needed a good reason to stay with him. She added that to regain the throne, Walter would need the help of the Taylor and Richmond families, and she is the direct Taylor heiress. Walter noted that the plan sounds good in theory, but in practice, its implementation would be very difficult and dangerous. After all, now the Taylor house is under the rule of Baron Ronan, and the girl herself is just a weak link in the big game. Grace replied that the sword's power was not only in what was visible on the outside, and he must trust her determination. She explained that when the right opportunity arose, Grace would be ready to become a truly worthy blade in his hands. Walter grabbed her by the neck and said that he did not tolerate pretense, because even the slightest falsehood creates weakness and vulnerability. He decided to ask if she had the determination to be a hardened blade in the most difficult trials. Grace was irritated by the question, as she reminded herself of her resolve every day as she watched her kind perish. She also mentioned this during her parents' funeral and when she heard threats from an unknown person who was following her. To show her determination, Grace silently kissed Walter, taking him by surprise, not allowing him to respond immediately. Stepping aside, she asked if he was willing to help and work with her to achieve her goal. Walter realized how wrong he was about her, because she is the blade that can wound even the one who holds it. The man decided to first listen to her plan, and only then make a final decision about further action. He was very curious about how she could use his love as a cover to take over the Richmond family and reclaim the Taylor throne. He wasn't even afraid of getting hurt on that sword. The main thing was that it would help achieve his goal and restore power. Meanwhile, unrest reigned in the Taylor estate, as they were being demanded to repay the debt immediately, creating pressure on everyone. The situation was so critical that the husband ordered his wife to give up all her valuables in order to salvage the situation a little. Despite his wife's delight, the husband explained that there was no other option, as Grace had gone missing. The woman got scared and offered to sell the land, of which they had so much that they could cover all the debts and get rid of the problem. Suddenly, they heard the voice of Madame Cornul, who said that the palace lands could not be sold, as they had a special status and value. The angry man ordered her to find Grace as quickly as possible and bring her to him immediately. Madame Cornul calmly replied that her disappearance might even prove to be beneficial to the family. She explained that the Saxe family were relatives of Her Majesty the Empress, and a scandal at the wedding would outrage her. She also noted that if they were not careful, the Empress's wrath could fall on Taylor Palace. The woman, in despair, grabbed Madame's hand and asked her what to do next. Madame advised to disown Grace and strike her name from the family register, demonstrating the detachment of the Taylor house. She added that then the girl would be responsible for her actions, and the Taylor Palace would become the full property of her husband. During this sorry, they were already dreaming about how they would manage the palace, and they were finally able to calm down. Delighted with the possibilities, the Countess decided to fully trust Madame Cornul and cast aside her doubts. Meanwhile, the carriage waited, and Jackson rode, covering his face to hide his bruise and fatigue. He couldn't forget Grace's insulting words about how she couldn't love him or touch him. The man, who only knew her as a quiet girl, couldn't believe that she could have a lover on the side. So he imagined finding them both and tearing the bastard to pieces in front of Grace. He wondered if tears would flow from her beautiful eyes when that happened. Imagining all this, he said her name several times, realizing that he liked her extremely. Meanwhile, Joseph, interested, stood for a long time at the door, not understanding why they could talk for so long. His curiosity was gnawing at him, and he was about to eavesdrop when suddenly he heard a warning voice telling him not to turn his neck. Hearing this, the man reflexively drew his sword from its sheath, preparing for the unexpected. He immediately directed it down to the throat of Taylor's maid, Jessica, taking his time making no sudden movements. Even though she was a woman, he decided to ask who she was before taking the sword. But the girl was not afraid of his threats and began to scream, asking what he would do to her if she did not tell her name. After that, she began to accuse him, and this so shocked the man that he immediately became polite. Meanwhile, Walter and Grace finished their conversation, and the girl didn't understand what Jessica was doing. She praised her for the fact that, despite the real panic in the palace, she managed to escape unnoticed. The girl finally introduced herself as Mrs. Grace's maid and confessed that Grace was her teacher of courage. Joseph couldn't help but agree, remembering how the girl had yelled at him and shown determination. Walter introduced his aide-de-camp, Joseph Rexton, who immediately caught Grace's attention. Grace immediately turned to him and expressed hope that they would get along in the future. These words immediately made Joseph lose his mind, because he didn't know how to react to her attention. Walter explained to everyone that from now on, Lady Grace would go with him to Richmond as his companion and lover. Hearing this, Joseph realized that all his hopes had been instantly shattered, leaving only despair. While Walter ordered the carriage to be prepared, Joseph wanted to know the details and tried to understand what was happening. Grace knew the rules and apologized that a distinguished knight had to fulfill the role of groom. Joseph was so impressed that he even began to feel embarrassed, not knowing how to react to her words. So he said that since childhood, he had dreamed of being a coachman, and that he liked it. After a while, having quickly put the carriage in order, they set off together for Richmond Palace. Walter rode alongside on his horse and listened to the girls' conversations, especially about wrists, without intervening. Jessica's next phrase about taking care of yourself during the fight with Jackson surprised the men. After all, both remembered how noticeable he was on their wedding day, and it was surprising. Meanwhile, Jessica was explaining to the lady how to swing properly, to strike, and not get hurt. Grace knew that these skills would not be useful to her, because next time it would not be limited to just a bottle of wine. Seeing the serious expression on Grace's face, Jessica took her hands and said that the beginning had already been made. Immediately after that, they continued their journey, but in silence, without distracting each other. Grace asked the girl not to worry, because she had taken the first step to regain her lands. She was determined and had no intention of stopping, despite the fatigue and difficulties of the journey. Jessica really liked this lady's determination because she showed willpower and courage in her actions. She immediately ordered Jessie to let everyone know about the beginning of her actions and her determination in the matter. Immediately after that, the girl jumped out of the carriage, demonstrating courage and determination in her actions. This could not go unnoticed by Joseph, who was speechless with surprise. Walter, watching this, remembered the girl's words about preparing to become a sharp sword, and realized that these were not empty words. Immediately after that, he heard Joseph say that they were in trouble because a welcome party had been prepared for them. After a while, the warriors saw a familiar silhouette and instantly realized that His Highness had returned to them. They had no time to congratulate him on his return when they noticed a beautiful girl coming out of the carriage. To prevent a repeat of what happened to Joseph, Walter immediately introduced her as his lover. The man's subjects, who had never seen a girl next to him, were very surprised by this unexpected news. That evening, his subjects were discussing Grace, that judging by her appearance, she had grown up in hothouse conditions, and that love was truly strong. The girl, listening to conversations about herself, was once again convinced of what the knights of the Richmond family really are. She couldn't help but notice their unity and the impressive number of people who were always there in difficult situations. Despite the time for rest, none of the knights relaxed. They maintained complete concentration and readiness. The Wall of Death is a place where it is impossible to last even a year, and these 500 people lived there for 10 years, proving their strength. Joseph suggested that Walter return the lady to the carriage to avoid any unforeseen situations that might occur. But Walter said to leave her alone, because the girl herself expressed a desire to inspect the detachment and was not afraid of danger. The man couldn't believe that she could be afraid of anything, because her face expressed the calculation of every next step. Eventually, one of the knights approached the lady and politely introduced himself, calling himself Andrew Isaac, the Earl's youngest son. Grace knew him and had heard that he was the youngest of Earl Isaac's 3 sons, so his introduction seemed familiar to her. The man offered to treat the girl to his food, and she gladly accepted. but quickly noticed that it was too much for her. Hearing that he would be driving the carriage from tomorrow, she suggested they eat together. She repeated the same words she had spoken to Joseph about nightly service as a coachman, and this, as before, had the same effect on her husband. Hearing that he dreamed of being a coachman, the rest of the knights began to joke about him, raising the spirits of the entire detachment. Seeing his assistant's laughter, Walter said that anyone could laugh at this, but not Joseph, who himself behaved in the same way. But he asked not to tell what the lady said at the meeting. Meanwhile, the rest of the knights were unhappy with the noise that was disrupting discipline, and immediately hinted at an extra person in the ranks. The man didn't have time to finish his thought when he suddenly saw a giant bird landing right in front of the entire group. Looking up at the sky, he noticed several more winged monsters, nothing like them, circling above them and posing a threat. Walter, feeling that the evening would not pass peacefully, was finally convinced of this when he saw the monsters in all their power. The noise made by the monsters disturbed Grace, so she decided to personally check what was happening in the air and on the ground. She had heard about monsters from her mentor many times, but she had only seen them in person today, which caused great shock and confusion. Walter, trying to ensure safety, ordered the girl to follow Andrew and stay away from the danger zone. Asking her to put on a hood, he reassured her, saying that she shouldn't worry because it would all be over soon and the threat would disappear. Meanwhile, Walter, having already drawn his sword, approached one of the monsters, ready to fight back and protect those around him from the attack. Without stopping fighting the monster, he ordered Andrew to quickly pick up Grace and take her away from danger to avoid harm. Grace, watching Walter's blows, understood the strength of those who had lived near the wall of death for 10 years, which was truly impressive. Suddenly, the girl caught herself thinking that what surprised her most was not the monsters, but the man himself, who was showing incredible courage. She considered him the embodiment of the god of war, as his calmness, strategy, and strength amazed even the most experienced knights. Legend has it that where the god of war passes, nothing alive remains, and every enemy is powerless before him and his power. Suddenly, Grace felt a strange gust of wind and, looking up, saw a huge monster approaching in front of her. Since she had never seen such creatures up close, the girl was confused and froze in place, not knowing what to do. The monster immediately took advantage of her immobility, grabbing her with its paws and lifting her into the air, lifting her high above the ground to carry her away. Andrew didn't have time to do anything. He just held the sword with trembling hands and ordered the monster to let go of the girl, praying for success. Immediately after that, he struck the monster on one of its wings, hoping that the injury would stop it for a while. This helped because the monster with the injured wing could barely fly, and unable to bear it, let go of the girl, losing control. At the last moment, Andrew managed to pick up Grace, saving her, and immediately after that kissed her, feeling relieved and happy. He was already glad that everything had worked out, when he suddenly realized that he was falling into the abyss himself, and fear gripped him completely. Not only he, but also the other knights saw this, and no one knew how to act properly to save a friend in danger. Walter instantly ran to the precipice, trying to find Grace and Andrew with his eyes, determined to save them both. He ordered the knights to bring a rope so that he could descend himself and helped those in mortal danger without delay. Meanwhile, the girl, unharmed, landed on the ground, escaping the fall and the dangerous height that frightened her heart. She fell directly on Andrew, who was unconscious, taking the full force of the blow, and that is what saved her from serious injury. Touching him carefully, Grace felt a faint pulse and realized that the man was still alive, and quickly set about saving him. But the worst was yet to come. Not far from them stood a wolf, aggressive, ready to attack any victim. Walter, who was meanwhile descending the rope, noticed the wolf and ordered Grace to immediately return to a safe place. Looking at the knight Andrew, who had saved her life, she resolutely decided not to retreat, because then he would definitely die. Walter did not understand her action, considering the girl a fool, and looked at her irritably. Meanwhile, the girl looked around, hoping to find something that could protect them from the monster. Suddenly, her gaze fell on the bow and arrows, and her heart beat faster because she knew that this could save them. Grace had been practicing archery since childhood, so she immediately understood how to handle arrows. As soon as the wolf got close enough for her to hit, the girl pulled the string and released the arrow, Suddenly, she realized that she had missed for the first time. Her hand was shaking, and she didn't have the strength to pull the string. At that moment, she felt the approach of death, just like the day her parents died as a child. Every memory of these terrible events gave the girl the strength to keep moving forward and living on. Then suddenly another man's hand touched Grace's, unexpected and strong, making her flinch. Turning around, she saw Count Walter, his appearance gradually dispelling the fear of death that had gripped her. And at that moment, the arrow finally hit the wolf, who was standing only a few meters away from them, causing him to fall. Walter gently touched her back, checking to see if the gargoyle's nails had injured her during the attack. Meanwhile, Sirius tried to revive Andrew, who lay unconscious, unable to regain consciousness on his own. Realizing that his brother would not recover, he had to carry him on his shoulders, carefully climbing the rocks. After that, they had to walk back, climbing large rocks, carefully controlling each step. Walter couldn't help but notice that despite the absence of gargoyle wounds, Grace was left with numerous bruises. Therefore, he decided to ask if the girl was able to climb the rocks herself, so as not to risk her life. In response to his question, the girl stretched out her arms to him, clearly hinting that she needed help and trust. Understanding her intention, the man silently lifted her into his arms, holding her tightly to prevent her from falling. Despite the night, not all the residents of Duke Richard's castle were asleep. There was restlessness and tension in the air. The man was clutching a letter that said that this time, too, the killer had failed to get rid of Duke Walter. The nervous man was approached by his wife, who feared that if he did not get rid of him, he would never regain his title of Duke. He was only 13 when he was sent to the Wall of Death, and for 10 years, no one was able to destroy him. The woman, trying to calm her husband, said that everyone in this palace considered him the master, and everyone was devoted only to him. His wife tried to convince him, pointing out that pitiful creatures like his grandmother rotting in the outbuilding would not affect him. Meanwhile, the Grand Duchess, who was indeed in the annex, learned that the Duke was finally returning home for the first time in 10 years. The maid really wanted him to come back, because then no one would dare to treat her like that. But the woman said she wanted to sleep. As she lay down in bed, she ordered them not to disturb her, because now she was indifferent to everything, and even danger seemed secondary. The very next morning, they finally arrived at Richmond Palace, where the sun played on the stone walls and stairs. The man was looking forward to returning home, because, despite everything, he had not been here for about 10 years. Seeing Grace in front of him, he decided to ask how she was able to escape from the hands of her guards and rescuers. When she returned, she saw all the knights bringing plants, flowers, and food, trying to please the girl. Seeing the Lord's knights, she greeted them, smiling and feeling at ease among the familiar faces. Grace didn't yet understand all the intricacies of the situation, because from the very beginning, she had promised to gain their respect and trust. Walter couldn't understand how the girl got what he had been striving for 10 years, fighting for it every day. In the end, he realized that this was not the case, because she had been preparing for this moment for many years, accumulating strength and knowledge. Standing by the abyss, the girl asked if Walter was scared. She watched his reaction carefully and attentively. Avoiding her question, the man asked if she was scared herself, and, as expected, received a negative answer. The girl had been waiting for this day for many years. Therefore, Grace asked to be called simply by her first name, because now they were in love, and the past of fear was left behind like a shadow. For the man, words like love or care were incomprehensible. For 10 years he survived, and his only goal was revenge. Understanding his conscience, she explained that this could cause problems, and that she had already sacrificed a lot to achieve this. To confirm her words, the man abruptly pulled her close and silently kissed her hand, expressing his respect and devotion. Continuing to hold her hand, he said, calling her by name, that she would ride with him into Richmond Castle. Soon they entered the palace to wild applause and music that echoed from all sides and on the stairs. As agreed, the girl rode right next to him on horseback, confident and without fear, feeling his support beside her. The current owners of the house watched them from above, carefully monitoring their every movement and reaction. As soon as they arrived at the palace, Walter immediately helped Grace off the horse, holding her hand carefully and lovingly. Such care for the girl could not go unnoticed, and everyone present felt this tenderness and attentiveness. The Duchess immediately sensed that something was wrong. Her gaze became attentive, and her heart was filled with a foreboding of change. She was so hypocritical that she changed her expression in a second and lied that she was glad to see his lordship. The woman said she didn't know about their visit, so she offered to show the girl to the living room. But Walter interrupted her, explaining that there was no need for this, and everything could be resolved differently. Holding her hand, he said that from now on she would live in the chandelier room and would never go anywhere else. The woman could barely contain herself, because it was a special room that ordinary guests never had access to. As soon as she was about to object, Walter sharply reminded her who exactly owned the castle, leaving no doubt. Extending his hand, he gestured for her to enter the palace, demonstrating his respect and hospitality. The man and woman had no idea what was happening, or who this strange woman was who entered the palace so easily. They considered it unacceptable to place a girl in the former duchess's chambers without even formally introducing her. The man assumed that Duke Walter had already managed to consider himself the master of the castle, but his regent was not going to give it to him so easily. In the end, he tried to reassure himself that although Walter was the Duke of Richmond, all power was in his hands. Meanwhile, not only the Duke and Rice arrived at the estate that day, but also other important guests and servants. Another girl approached the palace and was struck by its size, which immediately caused surprise and admiration. But she was even more surprised when she went inside and saw how luxurious the interior of the house was. Meanwhile, Grace and Walter were met at the threshold by two maids who bowed as a sign of respect, demonstrating politeness and loyalty to tradition. Once they were finally alone, Walter and Grace no longer had to pretend to be a couple in love. Grace stepped back and began to explore the palace from within, taking in the rooms and decorations that adorned its walls. Looking around the room, she noticed that many of the things had been recently arranged, and assumed that the Duchess had been using the former Duchess's room. This was what explained her anxiety and indignation when Grace was ordered to be placed in these very rooms. Carefully touching the lily, Grace felt the irony of the situation. A woman angry at being taken away from something that never belonged to her. While the girl was looking around, the man decided to ask how long she had been practicing this kind of acting. Continuing to admire the flowers, the girl said that these were not years of hard training, but that she was simply convincing herself that she was in love. Walter did not believe her words because he thought it would be extremely difficult to do, especially at her young age. Grace decided to turn the conversation to him because he could also be a good actor, and interested him with a question. She asked where the Duchess was now and why she hadn't met Walter, who hadn't been seen for over 10 years. Hearing this question, the man was a little upset and didn't know how to answer the girl correctly so as not to offend her. Not wanting to go into details, he briefly said that she was currently in another wing of the palace, away from the guests. Grace wasn't going to leave it at that, and asked where exactly the extension was, eager to learn more details. Meanwhile, the Duchess again saw horror in her dream, which oppressed her and caused inner fear and anxiety. In this dream, the woman was looking for her grandson, but could not find him among the others, which only increased the panic. One of the boys addressed her as Grandma, but she immediately realized that this was not her grandson, and her heart sank. She didn't understand why Walter was dressed in princely clothes, which created a strange and unsettling feeling. After that, the woman, kneeling, demanded the return of her real grandson, Walter, feigning strength and determination. After a dream, she suddenly woke up, trying to figure out what was reality and what was just a nightmare of her mind. A maid came into the room and announced that the Duke had finally returned, which caused the woman mixed feelings. She added that the lady who had arrived with him requested an audience, and this aroused the Duchess's curiosity and surprise. Grace asked the assistant if anyone had been watching them as they set off for the annex, eager to learn the truth. She already knew that she would be thought of as a woman that Walter had suddenly brought in, a person who had not seen the world for decades. It was expected that people would think she was after the Duke's fortune, but Grace didn't care about what outsiders thought. The current indifference to her person only played into her favor, allowing her to act without undue attention and suspicion. After some time, the maid returned from the widow's room and announced that she did not wish to meet or talk to anyone. Grace asked if she had correctly stated that the girl had arrived with the Duke, to be sure of the accuracy. After the answer, the girl asked to report her arrival again, but this time about meeting Grace Taylor. Eliza was born a princess of the imperial family of Deccan, and, upon marrying Richmond, became Grand Duchess. All subjects respected her status and called her queen, recognizing her authority and greatness in palace affairs. But all this is in the past, especially for the Marquise, who has drastically changed her attitude towards her. In addition to her disdainful attitude, she removed all the servants from the outbuilding and reduced the amount of firewood, which Madame Isaac greatly disliked. It was Madame who remained the only one loyal to the Grand Duchess, whom everyone respected and knew as a good ruler many years ago. Now no one remembers her. She just lies in bed and never goes outside, remaining forgotten. As soon as the former Duchess learned the name of the girl who persistently wanted an audience, it made her get out of bed. Upon learning that the girl's appearance did indeed resemble her parents, she assumed that the blood of the late Duke Taylor flowed in her. Madame Isaac, hoping to cheer up the Duchess a little, suggested inviting the girl to her place. The woman did not answer her question and asked again whether the Duke had indeed brought Taylor with him. Upon learning that this was true, the woman went back to bed and ordered the girl to leave the room immediately. Isaac wanted to say something else, but the woman interrupted her, her thoughts returning to her family. She reminded her that her 3 sons were about to return home right now. Arwen said nothing, leaving the Duchess alone, and said she would convey her words and then return. After a while, the maid of honor again expressed her wish to be left alone. After apologizing for the disturbance, Grace had to leave the annex without ever speaking to the Duchess. Grace really wanted to meet her, because without the support of the Grand Duchess, they would not have been able to cope on their own. However, the girl decided not to deviate from her plan and asked Jessie to monitor the events in the palace. Meanwhile, Arwen, believing she was left alone, heard a voice asking if she was cleaning the room herself. It was Grace again, wondering why there were no servants and no maids of honor except herself. Without stopping to clean up the dishes, the woman asked Grace again to leave the annex. In the end, it had to be done later, because Grace did not understand why the Grand Duchess was being looked after so poorly. The maid of honor wanted to tell the whole truth, but restrained herself and simply asked the girl to leave again. Finally, the girl tried to reach her and asked how the Duchess felt, watching how she was being treated. She also asked if the Duchess was awaiting an opportunity that could restore her rightful place and power. This state was well known to Grace, as she herself had spent years in the Taylor Palace, like a living corpse. Madame Isaac did not know what to answer the girl to such a direct and frank question. At that moment, she remembered the former Grand Duchess, who was radically different from the current one. Recalling this, she could not contain her emotions, because she really wanted the Grand Duchess to regain her rightful place. Realizing that she had managed to reach out, Grace asked for help to wake the Duchess and restore her strength. The woman replied that if the plan would help restore the Duchess's ladyship and return Richmond Castle, she was willing to give her life for it. She was always by the Queen's side at Richmond, and was the person the late Duke trusted above all others. In a word, she could gather the wives of all the knightly families who served in the House of Richmond. That is why Grace first needed her support, and only then wanted to use her influence to gain Eliza's support. Meanwhile, the Duke, talking to his wife, said that he had ordered to find out as many details as possible about Grace. The woman, meanwhile, remained outraged that such a young girl had been allowed to settle in the late Duchess's room. Realizing that Walter had forgotten that Richmond belonged to more than just the Duke, the man decided to personally remind him of this. The woman also had her own plan to disturb the Duke a little and make him nervous. As expected, her plan involved Lady Flora, the Earl's daughter, who had recently arrived at the palace. Before meeting Walter, Lady Flora considered knights to be rude, impolite, and unintelligent giants. However, during her meeting with the Duke, her impression changed dramatically, as she fell in love with him at first sight. Lady Flora imagined herself next to him and believed they made a perfect couple. But all dreams were shattered when Grace Taylor appeared, who actually took her place in the girl's fantasies. These thoughts had been weighing on her lately, but she couldn't stop thinking about the situation. Suddenly, 2 maids entered the room, eager to give the girl the latest news. Lady Flora immediately smiled, wanting to know what exactly they had learned about Grace. According to the servants, Trace belonged to the lowest level, and Marquis Rinko ordered to check everything around the Wall of Death. Upon learning this, the girl was scared, because those places are inhabited only by criminals and monsters. In addition, the girl learned that Grace was even given the former Duchess's room. Approaching the lady, the maids called her an angel, because even at such moments, she worried about the late Duchesses. Flora, trying to look innocent, even shed a tear to make the right impression. The girl gave them money for the news and said that if they found out anything else, they would immediately let her know. Left alone again, Lady Flora's gaze fell on a bouquet of roses, in which there was not enough room for one flower. Taking scissors and cutting off the extra rose, the girl said that there should be a worthy person next to the Duke. Holding the perfect bouquet in her hands, she believed that Grace should not get used to life on the estate. Meanwhile, Duke Walter was in his office doing paperwork. Joseph, not understanding the master's calmness, decided to ask why he did not strike the enemies in advance. The Duke answered his question with his own, asking why Joseph thought he would not be able to repel the enemy's attack. Joseph explained that the knights of the vassal families had arrived for an audience, but the Count of Lewin had driven them away. Many heads of houses who had served the Richmond family for many years had gathered at the gate. However, the guard did not let them inside, believing that their appearance was not appropriate for a meeting with the Duke. The man conveyed to them the words of the Marquis of Rinco that their appearance dishonored the honor of the Richmond family. A woman carefully watched all these events from her chambers. She watched as all these people were chased out of the palace without any explanation. Walter himself planned to purge upon arrival in Richmond, leaving none of them behind. Suddenly, his plans were opposed by Lady Grace, who said that he should not behave like that. She added that there should be no bloodshed in Richmond. After all, if he takes Richmond by force, his authority will be shaken, and the government will be called an uprising. Walter didn't understand why he had to act noble when even robbers didn't follow the rules. The girl said that even though it was hard, it was the only right way. Remembering this conversation, the man changed his perspective on the situation. Therefore, Walter asked Joseph to be patient a little longer, because his enemies thought he was wasting time. In fact, during this period, he selected and vetted all his loyal allies. He had been waiting for revenge for over 10 years and could have held out for a few more days. After that, Joseph reported that the Marquis of Rinco wished to see the Duke. As soon as the girls entered the office, Joseph added that Lady Flora also requested a meeting. Without being distracted from his business, Walter ordered them to go inside and await further instructions. After a while, all three of them were drinking tea, calmly discussing his long-awaited return home. The Marquise, pointing to the girl, introduced her as the only daughter of the Earl of Lune, a loyal vassal of Richmond. The woman could not help but remark that Lady Flora was as noble in soul as she was beautiful in face. Walter drank his tea in silence and listened as the Marquise persistently praised the girl's virtues to him. He could not help but confirm the Duchess's words that there was hardly a lady in the world more perfect in soul and body. But the man quickly got tired of empty chatter, so he directly asked about the real purpose of their visit. The Marquise replied that a simple greeting was not enough, since he had been absent for over 10 years. With these words, she subtly hinted at the guest he had brought, about whom rumors were already spreading. Walter did not start walking around and directly declared that this girl was his beloved, which caused surprise. The Marchioness guessed this, but still reminded him of the Duchess's room given to Grace. After all, this room belonged to a great landlady of Richmond, who was deeply respected by all the residents. It was a place where only representatives of the most noble families of the region were allowed to stay. At her words, the man briefly asked if she remembered who owned the estate. With a cold look, he made it clear that he wasn't going to do it twice. These words alone were enough to make the woman fall silent and lose confidence. Furthermore, she was frightened by the changes in his face, as if an invisible pressure was emanating from him. She even thought that someone from the imperial family was standing in front of her. But she immediately dismissed this thought, remembering the death of the crown prince in the carriage. Not wanting to escalate the situation, the woman apologized and added that the Duchess should be a respected person. Embracing Lady Flora, she hinted that she was the best match for him in Richmond. Looking at her haughty face, he was amazed at the naivety of her thinking that he could heed her advice. Besides, he already knew that all the proceeds went to the Marquise, and he decided to take advantage of that. However, he did not reveal his plans and simply asked them to leave, citing fatigue. Leaving the room, the Marquise stopped pretending to be polite, considering the Duke arrogant. She was convinced that Richmond was actually run by her Rinco family. Therefore, she decided to use Lady Flora, convincing her that the Duke was not indifferent to her. Flora doubted it deep down, but she really wanted to believe it. The Marchioness explained that he had lived for a long time near the Wall of Death without worthy company. So, in her opinion, Grace was only a temporary choice due to circumstances. She advised the girl to visit the Duke more often, demonstrating true aristocracy. Lady Flora, ready to do anything for his attention, listened intently to every word. Suddenly, the women noticed Grace, who they had just been gossiping about, approaching them. Despite rumors of low birth, her manners and appearance suggested otherwise. Even in her presence, the Marquise declared that the Duke would not be respected because of a rootless girl. She was certain that Grace wouldn't be able to pretend to be an aristocrat for long. That self-confidence disappeared when the girl walked past, lightly touching her shoulder. She didn't even show proper respect, which shocked the Marquise. No one had ever dared to treat her so disrespectfully before. Grace just smiled, finding it strange that such a woman would talk about shame. Lady Flora hastened to support the Marquise, saying that aristocrats were immediately visible. After a brief argument, Grace moved on without even bowing to the Duchess. The angry Marquise ordered the maids to stop helping the chandelier room. A lot of time had passed, and the Duke began to worry about Grace. He was not left with the words that her feelings could only be self-suggestion. He understood that she could influence people, and he was wary of this. A sudden strange noise snapped him out of his thoughts and alerted his assistant. Joseph went to check and saw a stranger entering the Duke's chambers. He instantly drew his sword, preventing it from getting any closer. But the stranger didn't look scared and even showed his face. His behavior reminded Joseph of that of Jessica, Grace's student. The Duke became interested and ordered the weapons to be removed. Walter guessed that it was Grace who had called him, and Eric was surprised that someone was addressing the lady by her first name. The situation changed when Grace entered the room and recognized Eric. She was sincerely happy to meet him, not hiding her emotions. Eric was also happy to see his lady after a long separation. Only Joseph remained confused, not understanding what was happening. Grace introduced the guest as Viscount Eric Napier, a loyal vassal of the Taylors. After meeting him, he apologized for his abruptness upon arrival. The Duke also apologized for his assistant's behavior. Eric asked Grace how her meeting in the annex had gone. She replied that she had only seen Madame Isaac, who had promised support. The Duke was not surprised, because his grandmother had not communicated with anyone for a long time. After the conversation, he ordered Joseph to take the Viscount out unnoticed. The mention of his grandmother brought back a wave of painful memories. As a child, he had seen her cry quietly over the loss of her grandson. This led him to believe that even life itself could be a crime. After all, it was he who survived, while the true heir died. Therefore, he considered it his duty to visit her. He felt guilty for taking away both her life and her grandson's name. As before, the woman lay in bed, as if she were simply waiting to die. Entering the room, he noticed that nothing had changed in 10 years. Coming closer, he asked why she was torturing herself so much. Because of its isolation, Richmond fell into decline, and no one punished traitors. But looking at her, Walter realized that she was not punishing her enemies, but him. Meanwhile, the Marquise was in her room pondering the events of the day. The memory of Grace's impudence particularly irritated her. With each passing minute, her anger only grew, and she could barely contain herself. She asked the maid about the Blood Moon's errand. The frightened maid replied that it would take at least 3 months, because most likely Grace or her parents had committed a crime, which is why she didn't even have a last name. This information reassured the Marquise a little, and she decided that it could be true, because it sounded quite logical. After all, near the Wall of Death, there is a village inhabited by various criminals and thieves without any laws. The maid confirmed this, adding that in their area it was not even considered a crime, and this frightened the Duchess. What she heard convinced her even more that the short-sighted Duke had given the noble Duchess's room to a shameless girl. She didn't care what the girl did, whether she proved her lineage or made excuses, because Richmond Castle would still be hers. She was certain that he would eventually destroy both her and the Duke of Richmond, exactly according to her own well-thought-out script. Meanwhile, Grace herself learned from Eric all the news about the events that had occurred during the period of her disappearance. Eric really wanted the lady to be satisfied with the result, for which she allowed him to demand any payment. She even promised to fulfill any of his wishes, because she believed that his efforts fully deserved the reward. The man was pleased to hear the praise, but he replied that he was only following her orders and had done nothing special. His life, like Grace's, was difficult from childhood, as he was also left without parents and support early on. It was then that they met for the first time, without even suspecting how closely their destinies would be intertwined in the future. Then Grace herself approached him and said that they could only cry after taking revenge on the enemy who had taken their families. Her appearance in his gray life became like a bright splash of young greenery amidst joyless sadness. From then on, he stopped crying at the grave and, using the tailor's hidden money, carried out her errands. Their last meeting took place just before Taylor's ill-fated wedding, which was to change everything. Then Eric tried to calm her down, reminding her that this was just part of the plan to return to the Taylor family. However, he was afraid that one day she would become someone else's wife and not return, and his world would become gray again. Grace noticed that he was lost in thought, so she spoke up herself and offered a reward for the work done. Eric didn't understand why she was paying him, because he considered himself her person, and his efforts completely her property. Grace explained that she does this because she wants to reward the loyalty and work of those who serve her without hesitation. Finally, he asked what would happen to the Duke of Richmond after she regained her legal rights. She replied that when she became Duchess Taylor and the king returned to duty, nothing would bind them anymore. This news greatly pleased the man, although he carefully concealed his joy and did not show it. Suddenly, Jessica and Joseph entered the room and warned them that someone was approaching them quickly. It was also reported that the Marquise's people had turned to Blood Moon to learn the truth about her past. Fortunately, they turned to Eric, and he managed to buy Grace about 3 months of time. After that, Eric had to leave the palace, as he still had a lot of unfinished business waiting for him. At parting, under the surprised looks of Joseph and Jessica, Eric asked Jessica to take care of the lady. Joseph couldn't believe that he was so fearless. After all, he jumped from a height that made him dizzy. Seeing the potential of Ms. Taylor's people, he realized that they needed to be handled with the utmost care. Meanwhile, Grace pretended to be reading a book, although in reality she was waiting for unwanted guests to appear. Soon 2 maids came to her and informed her that dinner was ready and set. Jessica, hiding aside, was furious at their impudence, for they had entered without the hostess's permission. When Joseph asked why she wasn't with the lady if she was so worried about her, she replied that Grace had undergone the same training and was able to handle herself. She explained that the essence of this preparation is to wait, and then to suddenly seize the deadlock. While the maids were setting the table, the girl coldly asked why they were coming in without the hostess's permission. The maids were confused by the unexpected question and could not immediately find any answer. They were annoyed that she acted as if she were truly the full mistress of this house. In addition, rumors about her possible criminal past completely clouded the girl's common sense. After all, even to become a maid in the ducal palace, you need to have an impeccable reputation, and Grace, in their opinion, ended up in the castle only thanks to the Duke's grace, without any merit. It was later revealed that it was Lady Flora who had ordered Lady Grace's dinner to be served that evening. She wanted to check if the girl knew the rules of etiquette, mandatory for a true aristocrat. Lady Flora was certain that no matter how elegant Grace looked, she would not be able to distinguish between the right utensils. So she ordered the maids to stay in the room and carefully watch her every move. Giving them the coins, she said that this could be crucial evidence to expel the girl. The maids continued to set the table in silence, deciding that the lady's irritation was caused by hunger. Seeing only 1 piece of meat, Grace heard the excuse that they didn't have time to cook anything else. Finally, the maids moved to the main room, setting out numerous utensils to test her true manners. Looking at all this nonsense, the girl directly asked who ordered them to do this, because from the beginning they were talking nonsense. The girls didn't even answer her question, and just waited for her to make a mistake when choosing cutlery. At the same time, they, not ashamed of her presence, began to hint that she did not belong to the aristocrats at all. Imagine their surprise when she chose the steak knife without a single mistake. This simple action was enough for Grace to make them immediately shut up and stop making fun of her. Without even touching the food, she plunged a knife into the steak and ordered the entire dinner to be cleared from the table immediately. As they stared at the knife, the girl said that she had given them enough chances, but now there would be no mercy. Immediately after that, she called her personal assistant, knowing that she was right there. Jessie, who was barely restraining the urge to hit the maids, instantly appeared in the room at the call. Grace pointed to the maids and asked if they were the ones who had accompanied her along with His Majesty. Once she was convinced of this, she asked her assistant to keep track of where they went and who they met. Meanwhile, Walter remembered the day he traded lives with the prince for his own salvation. It turned out that the real Walter himself asked for this because it was the only way to keep the boy alive. He added that if it was too difficult, then at least he could keep quiet and hide the truth as much as possible. These were the last words of the real Walter before he perished alive in the flames. Her Majesty immediately guessed that the boy was not her grandson and suffered greatly because of this. The boy couldn't breathe as if his lungs were still clogged with smoke, even though the fire had destroyed the others. The next moment, he abruptly opened his eyes and realized that it was just a dream about the past. Rubbing his eyes wearily, the man realized for a few seconds that these events were long behind him. Meanwhile, Grace had already woken up and was taking notes on all the events that had happened to her recently. She mentioned that Marquis Henry Rinko was responsible for administrative matters and finances, and his wife Elsa controlled the castle. The military power belongs to the family of the Count of Lewin, so to regain Richmond, it is necessary to subordinate all three branches of government. Grace didn't have time to complete the plan because Jessie came into the room apologizing for disturbing her. She came to tell me where the maids who had been behaving so strangely yesterday had gone. During a certain time, she followed them and learned a lot of gossip about her lady. Jessie held back so as not to give herself away and punish them, but suddenly something strange happened. She saw how someone grabbed both maids, trying to get rid of them. What followed surprised even Grace when she heard that they had simply been brutally beaten. After that, the girl decided to check on his lordship and went to his room. Instead of Walter, she met his assistant there, who did not understand her appearance. Joseph could not explain Walter's disappearance and said that this happened to him sometimes. Even when near the wall of death, he could disappear for days without being himself. Joseph tried to calm Grace, assuring her that nothing would happen and he would return. Meanwhile, Walter was truly alone and thinking about everything that had happened. He remembered all the people he had been connected to in his life. While he was thinking, a hired killer crept up on him imperceptibly, sword in hand. In 10 years, Walter had never been seriously injured, so he easily caught the attacker. He realized that this was not a professional at all because he got scared and immediately ran away. Walter noticed that the man was running away as if he had seen a monster and decided to check his face. Seeing the reflection, he realized that he was indeed not much different from a monster. Even his loyal knights behind his back call him the Mad Duke of Metal Blood. While he was thinking about this, Grace finally found him and decided to visit him. The man was sure that no one needed him, so he was surprised to see her. Grace, sitting down opposite him, explained it, said that she was looking for him to talk to, and had guessed to check the bedroom. Walter asked how she could remain so calm and not lose her composure. She clarified whether he was interested in how she was still holding up, or whether she hadn't gone crazy from what she had experienced. The girl said that every day she imagined herself standing at the altar next to the relative of the empress who killed her parents. She looked at those who used her property as if it were her own, forgetting who the true heiress was. At such moments, she often imagined burning them all to the ground. Since childhood, she had repeated one phrase, clutching the cloth in her hands, that he was alive. It was the thought that Walter was alive that saved her every time she felt unbearable rage, or when she was drowning in despair, and she repeated it to herself day after day. She was firmly convinced that if she could hold on despite everything, then that guy would be even more able to endure and not break. As it turned out later, she was not mistaken, because despite all the events he had experienced, the guy also managed to remain strong and invincible. Grace believed that one day he would want to put everything back in its place, and then she would be the one to support him. To fight alongside him on equal terms, she needed to become much stronger, and this was her main motivation to move on. After this conversation, the girl realized that he had long become both a lighthouse and an anchor for her that kept her from falling. Only thoughts of him helped her endure all the hardships, difficulties, and blows of fate, preventing her from finally breaking down. After telling him about everything she had been through, she asked him to hold on too, because she had bet too much on him. In addition to taking revenge on her enemies, she sought to restore glory to her name and continue the great work of her ancestors. To do this, His Grace had to become a ruler worthy of her devotion, strength, and boundless faith. The man, listening to her, couldn't help but notice that behind the polite words lay genuine concern that truly supported him. After that, they decided not to touch on the subject anymore and just spend time together in peace. The girl calmly reported that Rinko's family was probably preparing a trap to frame her in the near future. Walter, who did not expect this at all, was shocked by the meanness of his relatives, although he knew their hypocrisy well. She explained that the maids who brought the dinner were brutally beaten, and this could be used as evidence against her. Walter cautiously asked if she could handle the future false accusations and attacks. Having placed the chess piece, the girl calmly replied that from the very beginning she was just a pawn in their game. Continuing the game, Grace added that she would even be offended if the enemies didn't take such obvious bait. While she was outlining her plans, the boy could not hide his amazement at her cool-headed chess skills. Walter also promised not to stay away and assured that he would do everything possible on his part. Meanwhile, the Marchioness again indulged her own vanity by trying on a luxurious jewel. It turned out that this was a decoration of the late Duchess, which the Marquise had appropriated and was now enjoying praise. Lady Flora could not contain her admiration and said that in such an outfit she looked like a real queen. These words greatly pleased the Marquise and only emphasized her sense of her own greatness. Turning to the woman next to her, she praised her for her wonderful upbringing of her daughter and her humility. After that, she even let Flora sit next to her, showing special affection. Pointing out the many jewels, the Marquise asked which piece of jewelry she liked the most. Flora was stunned to hear that she could receive one of them as a personal gift. It was a special room where, for centuries, the jewels of many generations and the symbol of the family's power were kept. Therefore, as soon as Elsa fled to the annex, the Marquise immediately took possession of the keys to that room. With these keys, she could control all the noble ladies of the castle, keeping them in bondage. Flora's mother asked the Marquise to choose the jewelry herself, relying on her refined taste. The Marquise quickly noticed the jewel that perfectly accentuated the young girl's appearance. She stated that she was giving it to officially show Lady Flora's new position to the entire court. Flora perfectly understood the meaning of such a gesture and replied that it was a great honor for her. In fact, the Marquise wanted to demonstrate that she would decide who would become the new Duchess. Flora turned to the maids for advice, accustomed to them always showering her with flattery. However, this time they were silent and did not rush to insult Lady Grace as they had done before. Their bodies still bore the marks of beatings from that very dinner service to Grace. One maid said that someone grabbed them, beat them, and threatened them to keep quiet about everything that happened. The Marquise already had her own plan, so she just hugged them, calling them almost her own daughters. Having gained their trust, she intended to use the information she gained against Grace. Meanwhile, Walter could not forget the words that from now on he would have to live under a different name. It was that day that he first put on the mask that hid his true face. Only in this way could he survive among the people who surrounded him with cruelty and hatred. Over time, even he himself began to forget who he really was behind this cold mask. It seemed to him that his own life had long ceased to belong to him because he had never lived the way he wanted. But the girl's words that he was her lighthouse and anchor suddenly pulled him out of the darkness. At that moment, he woke up and realized that he had again had a dream about the past that was haunting him. Going to the window, he saw that day had long since dawned and night was behind him. Even though he had just woken up, the man fell back onto the bed, exhausted from sleep. But he still had to get up, and when Joseph entered his room, he was surprised to see him. After all, having known Walter for a long time, he thought he wouldn't see him for the next few days. Reading the letter, the man explained that he couldn't sit idle for long because it exhausted him. Looking at the host's behavior, Joseph noticed that something had clearly changed in him recently. Meanwhile, Walter studied all the financial documents and learned that half of the gold reserve had disappeared somewhere. So he ordered Joseph to prepare 5 rooms in the darkest corridor where no light could reach. Pointing to the list on his desk, he ordered everyone listed there to be brought in personally. The man wanted Joseph to put each person in a separate room so they couldn't see each other. But what to do with them next, Joseph Walter instructed him to decide on his own, without interference. This behavior once again convinced the man that there was something definitely wrong with Walter's character and habits. However, he realized that he needed to lock everyone in their rooms and press them firmly to find out the truth. Meanwhile, Lady Grace was strolling with her assistant, enjoying the quiet morning air. During their walk, they unexpectedly encountered His Grace, which made them freeze. The man immediately guessed that the two were going to head to the annex, and smiled at his assumption. Grace confirmed his words, stating that she would wait there until the Duchess agreed to receive her. Walter remarked that it would be appropriate for her to bring a book with her, because without a thick book, the weight would be unbearable. Grace, like Joseph, noticed that there were noticeable changes in the man's behavior and outlook. Meanwhile, the guy continued to explain that she would wait forever for consent, so he suggested acting decisively. He explained that if she doesn't come out to the fire from the outside, she needs to create it from within to ignite desire. Grace was so impressed by his advice that she was speechless, not knowing what to say. Walter didn't find his words strange, thinking that the Duchess would only get a little angry and then get up. So, in addition to Joseph, Jessica and Grace asked if he was okay, and received a smile in return. Walter just smiled at their words, saying that he had always been like that, and that was indeed true. Aristakhan was always distinguished by his directness and irascibility, so his words matched his character and manners. On his way back, he asked them to do as he had told them, explaining that the Deccan clan was known for its straightforwardness and hot-temperedness. With these words, he wanted to remind her that she knew his real name, and that explained his changes. After that, Grace understood what caused the changes in his character and behavior, and felt relieved. That's why, before the man had time to go far, she confirmed that she actually knew his real name. When she was a child, in moments when she wanted to give up, she remembered him fighting for his life on the wall of death. She lived on, repeating his name like a mantra, for he had become the embodiment of the mythical god of war. It was a great honor for her to mention his name, and it became even more habitual than breathing, every day. Meanwhile, arriving at the annex, Grace again heard Madame say that she would not leave even if everything around her was on fire. However, Grace decided to listen to her husband's advice and burst into the bedroom uninvited, wanting to start the flames. Eliza was lying motionless in bed when Grace entered the room. To the Duchess, the girl's words seemed sarcastic, because she acted as if she were innocent. Finally, for the first time in a long time, the woman got out of bed and graced someone with her attentive gaze. Grace noticed that despite her years of immobility, she exuded a commanding spirit, like a true queen. This is what, in her opinion, a true queen of Richmond should look like, strong and steadfast in the face of difficulties. Grace apologized again for her behavior and said that sooner or later she had to show her impudence. After all, both knew that the Duchess would never have accepted if she had humbly waited for permission to meet. Grace decided to ask if she even cared why she was looking for a meeting and what she had come for. The woman replied that she was not interested, but was surprised that an unmarried daughter of a noble family followed the Duke. With these words, she wanted to reproach the girl for having no honor or dignity before her family. Grace explained that if she had not followed His Grace, she would already be a daughter-in-law in the House of Saxe. Approaching the woman, she clarified that she would become the daughter-in-law of the family that had completely destroyed her lineage and inheritance, and she decided to inquire, asking the Duchess's opinion, whether Taylor would fully support such a decision. The woman could not answer this question, so she remained silent for a long time, not knowing what to say in response. The former Duchess was supported by Madame Isaac, who reminded the girl who she was talking to. But the girl didn't listen and continued to wonder why the woman was giving all of Richmond to be torn apart and living as if she were waiting to die. For the first time in many years, Grace was the only one who could bring a real, albeit sad, smile to the woman. After lighting a cigarette, the woman said she wasn't interested in what Grace wanted from her, but she answered her question anyway. She hinted that what she had lived for all these years had long since disappeared forever, with no chance of return. Therefore, she asked the girl to leave her wounds alone and let her fall asleep without worries. After this brief but important conversation, the girl was expected to leave the former Duchess's bedroom. But Grace wasn't going to give up so easily and decided to stay as long as necessary. The girl continued to tell about the events, noting that she had followed the prince's advice, but this was not enough. After all, to ignite her interest, a bigger flame was needed, much brighter and more tangible. And it was at this moment that Jessica burst into the room, announcing that the Marquise's maids were going to the chandelier room. Grace had long suspected the Marquise's plan to accuse her of beating the maids without any evidence. So as the maids approached, she asked Walter to simply watch, as interfering could make the situation worse. Hearing a sharp noise, the girls realized that time was running out, and they had to act quickly. As soon as Jessica left the room, the maids appeared before Grace, ready to carry out the order. And Grace herself calmly drank tea, as if nothing was happening, maintaining an outward calm. One of the women, looking disdainfully at Grace, said that the Marquise was calling her to her, namely, to the punishment room, where the Marquise herself was to act as judge and administer justice. Before Grace arrived, there were already many of the noble ladies of the castle in the room, already gathered to listen. Many years ago, Empress Isabella, Eliza's mother, used this place to punish court ladies and maids. But now in the Empire, the person with a particular passion for the punishment room was none other than the Marquise Rinco. Everyone present knew why the meeting had been called, and they actively discussed Grace, exchanging thoughts in whispers. All attention was focused on the abused maids, and everyone present wanted to know the truth. But everyone fell silent as soon as Grace entered, calm and confident, as if nothing had happened. The court ladies did not dare to say a word, but their looks said everything without words or hints. Seeing an empty chair, the girl assumed that this was the place intended for her, and sat down, pondering the situation. As soon as she decided to ask about the reason for the call, one of the ladies immediately tried to stop her, stating that no one was allowed to speak. By doing so, the maid wanted to show her as ill-mannered, unfamiliar with manners and etiquette. After that, the gossip about Grace continued, despite her presence in the room and calm demeanor. Despite the insults and obscene words, Grace stood firm and proud, showing no weakness. The Marquise, who was enjoying their words, nevertheless asked them to be quiet, reminding them of the purpose of the gathering. She pointed at the maids and asked Grace if she remembered these women, testing her reaction. Grace answered without hesitation that these were the very same maids who served her dinner and carried out her orders every day. The Marchioness clarified that these were the same maids that Lady Flora had sincerely sent to help Grace, confirming the importance of the evidence. As soon as Grace tried to say something in her defense, the indignant voices of those present did not allow her to say anything. Now the maids were demanded to recount everything that had happened that evening, describing every moment in detail. The girls said they had been cruelly abused and mentioned Lady Grace, although she could not understand their actions at dinner. But, as expected, many of the words about her were made up or distorted, which did not correspond to reality. Grace was prepared for such a situation and stood firm, without losing her composure and confidence. Meanwhile, the maids tried to portray themselves as victims, claiming that they had even been threatened with their lives in order to arouse sympathy. It seemed that everyone present was convinced of Lady Grace's guilt, leaving her no chance to defend herself. And as expected, no one believed her words that she had done nothing of the sort. But Grace decided to ask the maids if they were sure it was her they saw then, without giving in to emotions. As expected, they could not give an exact answer, but tried to tie it to history by inventing details. The girl noted that the voice could be similar, and the details of the dinner could only be known by those close to Lady Flora, and this was indirect evidence. After that, she began to prove her own arguments of innocence, forcing the court ladies to fall silent in surprise. The Marquise could not help but admit that this woman was not easy, because she held herself with rare confidence and composure. She nevertheless reminded those present that she had listened to both sides, and it was she who dictated the rules of the game, determining the order of the hearing. The Marquise explained that there was no need to rush the verdict, so she ordered all three to be taken to an underground prison to wait. The maids, who had already been treated this way, could not understand why they were being treated so unfairly and harshly. Grace knew well about this prison, which, according to legend, could almost instantly break the mind of anyone who found themselves there. Lady Flora watched with undisguised pleasure as the maids were led into the dungeon, enjoying the scene. It is unknown what would have happened to the girl if Walter had not entered the room. He changed everything with one step. Grace was more glad to see him than ever before, for she felt that his presence would bring order and peace. Walter's voice alone was enough for everyone to take their hands off his beloved. Not daring to argue, a few minutes ago, Joseph reported that he had interviewed everyone in charge of the treasury without any hesitation or doubt. Joseph couldn't help but notice that interviewing 5 people in less than an hour was an incredibly fast and impressive feat. He couldn't help but marvel at their impudence, because they stole money so calmly without even coming up with a reasonable reason. Walter then instructed Joseph to keep their testimony in a safe place, so that no one could destroy it. Just then, Jessica's assistant arrived and told her what was happening to Lady Grace. In the presence of His Grace, no one was so self-confident, and everyone felt his greatness and authority. Even the Marquise, who until recently considered herself the mistress of this place, was forced to bow her head in humility before him. He immediately turned to her and asked what they were doing here, watching her every move and word. The woman responded with general phrases that she was solving internal problems independently and in accordance with all laws. However, fear immediately appeared on her face as soon as the boy asked how long Empress Isabella's methods had become commonplace. He also couldn't help but mention the daughter of the late Empress Isabella, who forbade the use of her mother's methods. The woman's words that this was one of the most effective methods did not convince Walter, and he remained cold and reserved. When her husband began to inquire into the details of domestic problems, she tried to explain that he should not worry about trifles. But the Lord resolutely decided to deal with this matter on his own, demonstrating his confidence and willingness to act without help. As expected, the maids could not answer when exactly they were beaten, because they were lost in their own memories and fear. They were only able to briefly describe the events of that evening that had happened to them, leaving many details unsaid. However, their words were garbled, and the girls could not clearly explain where they were or how long it had been going on. To the great surprise of everyone present, the man ordered the head of security to be called to investigate the situation. Understanding that many people will be involved in the scandal, the woman asked not to make an excessive sensation out of it and to remain calm. But Walter once again reminded us who makes the decisions in this estate, emphasizing his own power and authority. This made the woman fall silent in dissatisfaction, because she understood that contradicting him was pointless and dangerous. Turning to the maids, he said that he would call them later to find out the truth. But for now, he ordered them to rest and not worry. After that, he silently extended his hand to Lady Grace, hinting that it was time for them to leave, and she understood his intention at once. As soon as the girl gave him her hand, he quickly turned and headed out of the room, without stopping for a second. Then he left the Lady Marquise disgraced in front of everyone, as many realized that her word was worthless and had no weight. Grace couldn't help but notice the sly smile on the Duchess's face, which meant that everything was just beginning, and the struggle was ongoing. She couldn't get that smile out of her head, because she felt that the Marquise didn't look like a defeated person, even though it was obvious. In addition, she knew that her goal was to deprive His Grace of any power, but they could not attack openly because of the risk. That's why they decided to use Grace as one of the pawns in their cleverly devised, albeit unreliable, game against him. In Grace's opinion, their plan was very poorly constructed, because with His Grace's intervention, all the accusations crumbled to dust, and even if he hadn't helped her, they would never have said what they wanted, because she remained uncontrollable and vigilant. Suddenly, she heard a man's voice asking her to soften her expression so that it wouldn't seem cold and unapproachable. He explained that she shouldn't walk around with such an icy expression on her face, because it repels people and creates unnecessary obstacles. Pointing to the people around him, Walter remembered that to everyone they were a couple in love, and everyone expected them to show tenderness and care. The girl's expression changed, and she asked if she now looked like a touched woman, trying to fulfill his request. Continuing to walk further, the man remembered that he had brought back to life more than 1,000 knights from the Wall of Death. He couldn't help but remind Grace that he had brought her here so that she could become his sharpest sword and carry out difficult tasks. The girl didn't know what to say at first, but later said that it seemed as if he had completely forgotten her words and her intentions. She repeatedly said that she would reclaim the Taylor family lands, and she was ready to do so at any cost, without doubt or hesitation. Walter did not deny that he had heard such words before, but now he did not understand why they tormented his heart and disturbed his thoughts. Trying to change the subject, Walter asked how everything had turned out with the Grand Duchess, wanting to avoid unnecessary details. The girl explained without detail that the Duchess had not woken up, but that two specific things, known only to her, were needed to awaken her. The first thing was a clear goal to act on, and the other was a shock that could affect her emotional state and feelings. The man didn't understand why the woman had suddenly fallen silent, and he was curious about what she was hiding and what her plans were for the future. As it turned out, the girl had already come up with a plan on how to wake up the Empress, using unconventional methods and tricks. To do this, she needed the help of His Grace, who sought to know his own role in this story and understand the consequences. Walter listened carefully to the girl's words, who said that the Duchess could only be awakened when she felt real anger. If it didn't sound straightforward, Walter was the only one who could arouse real anger in her. After all, according to historical data, his family has always been distinguished by its hot-temperedness and straightforwardness, and sometimes even excessive. And this man, who inherited their blood, had to become that very flame that awakens emotions. Grace continued the conversation, explaining that the Grand Duchess was slowly acting as if she expected immediate death, but still did not dare to commit suicide. It was because of this that the girl believed that the Duchess was waiting for Walter, because he could become a key figure in her life. Walter was not sure about the correctness of such a decision, believing that he was unable to change the situation. After all, he had written many letters for 10 years, and upon his return, he immediately visited her, trying to establish contact. However, the woman didn't even look at him, so the man thought he didn't mean as much to her as Grace thought. In his opinion, he was only a sinner who had survived at the cost of the lives of her son, daughter-in-law, and his own grandson, and this made his guilt grave. So he decided to say outright that another attempt could only have the opposite effect and deepen the problem. But the girl stood her ground, explaining that this was the only right way out of the situation that they could choose. When he said she could immediately close the door in his face, Grace explained that she had to get out of bed first. It was at this moment that the man realized that the lady's plan no longer seemed senseless and ineffective, but was beginning to make sense. Suddenly, Joseph intervened in the conversation, having received documents related to the garrison from the head of security, and reported the news. The man reported to the girl and said that he should leave now, fulfilling his duties and maintaining order. Finally, Grace said she would wait for him tomorrow morning, leaving hope for a continuation of their conversation. The man did not respond to this, and leaving Grace alone, returned to his duties in the palace. Meanwhile, the Marquis already knew about the interrogation and understood that each of the participants said only what was beneficial to him, shifting the blame onto others. But this was only one of the problems, because another was the troops, which created constant threats and complicated the situation. While the man was finding solutions to all his problems, his wife came to his room, bringing unexpected worries. She hadn't even had time to go inside when she saw the complete mess and suggested calling the maids to clean it up. However, she immediately realized the inappropriateness of her joke when her husband began to shout that Walter was digging into all their affairs. In addition, he had already heard that the Duke's mistress had never been imprisoned, which added to the tension and unease. The man's wife approached him and said that this was just the beginning of their game, and they were just placing their pieces on the field. She added that any actions of the Lord would not be able to affect the game they were playing, and this determined their advantage. In her opinion, some papers are not capable of changing the situation or influencing the real moves of the game being played behind the scenes. Instead, everyone in their palace was an obedient puppet who carried out all commands without resistance, asserting control over the situation. Meanwhile, Grace decided to take a walk in the garden, trying to calm her mind and find some peace amidst the tension. Strangely enough, she encountered Lord Walter, who was leaning against one of the columns, looking exhausted and confused at the same time. The man said briefly and wearily that he could no longer bear all these worries and burdens that had accumulated over the years. After that, they decided to go to Walter's grandmother, trying to wake her up and awaken emotions that had been dormant for years. During all this time, as in all the previous years, the woman never got out of bed, except for the occasion during Grace's visit, which left a mark on her memory. In the end, the man decided to listen to the girl's advice and try to light the fire in the woman's heart on his own, awakening feelings. He remembered his grandmother's instructions before heading to the wall of death, a reminder of survival thanks to her family. Therefore, the boy never had the thought of remaining dead, and he resolutely sought to return with all his achievements and honor. Leaving the palace, the boy turned around and saw the Grand Duchess watching him from the window, leaving a mark on his heart. The boy, trying to make amends to the woman, promised to return alive and restore her proud name and the Richmond family. He also wanted the woman to be able to wait for him, and the moment when everything that was taken from her would be returned to her. But over the years, the woman became so indifferent that nothing interested her, and the world seemed alien and cold to her. The Grand Duchess, of course, was not happy about His Grace's appearance in her room, which added tension to the atmosphere. When Madame Isaac tried to stop the Duke, she was prevented by Grace, who held her hand, preventing her from acting. The woman immediately ordered both of them to get out, but they weren't even going to listen to her, ignoring orders and authority. Walter recalled that before going to the Wall of Death, he ordered her not to die, but to wait for his return, leaving hope. The woman did not understand the meaning of these words because, despite everything, she still remained alive and able to act independently. However, Walter, looking at her appearance, said that she lived in a terrible place with a view of graves, which was depressing. The woman replied that she had also ordered the Duke to survive and gain strength, but he had instead brought an unmarried girl to the castle, breaking the agreement. The man explained that he had no choice but to turn the situation around, because otherwise, it was impossible to understand how rotten everything had become here. The woman added that everything should be done with dignity and intelligence, not as lowly and dishonorably as is happening now. Unable to bear it, Eliza said that his manner of speaking was simply unbearable, to which he replied that it was a family trait. After that, he silently brought her food under her nose, doing his duty but silently emphasizing his attitude and position. He decided to mock the Grand Duchess, saying that she was so weak that she couldn't even lift a spoon, so he offered to feed her himself. Unable to bear it, the woman, calling the man by his real name, ordered him to get out of there. Madame Isaac had no choice but to simply watch all this, feeling inner tension and anxiety. While the Grand Duchess was trying to chase her husband away, Grace suddenly approached her, appearing without warning. The girl explained that she was glad to see her back in the ranks and noted that communication was very important to her. She added that His Grace was very worried about her, although the man himself did not feel it, but decided to remain silent. The girl bowed and said that despite being a little late, she would like to greet her properly. After that, giving her real name, she said that she congratulated the Grand Duchess of Richmond, hinting that for her she would always remain the real Duchess. The woman silently looked at the girl kneeling before her, because at that moment she remembered an event from the past. And that's exactly how her father swore allegiance to the Duchess back then, when she was still a very powerful and influential person. But the woman couldn't find anything to say to the girl, so she decided to remain silent, hiding her true feelings. Meanwhile, Joseph joined her, announcing that he had urgent news that required immediate attention. He immediately told them that the maids had committed suicide, leaving suicide notes. The man then added that the Marchioness's maids of honor were heading straight for the outbuilding, and by all accounts, they were planning to accuse her again and drag her to prison. Before leaving the Grand Duchess, the girl, as if nothing had happened, returned and asked her to at least have a little food, promising to return later. As soon as they left the Grand Duchess's room, Walter said that they would most likely lock her in prison anyway, leaving no chance. Race had guessed this a long time ago, so she reacted to the news quite calmly, hiding her true emotions and excitement. But the man was a little worried, because according to legends, you could go crazy there in just a few days, which was very dangerous. Grace confidently said that she would cope, and if not, she gave him the right to refuse her. She was sure that this would not happen, because she would survive in the end and return as the true mistress of the Taylor lands, unbreakable and determined. Meanwhile, the Marquise's maids had already arrived at the outbuilding, preparing to carry out orders and regain control of the situation. As expected, after some time, the Marquise's maids of honor personally threw Grace into prison, leaving her no chance of escape. The Marquise, who had long desired to avenge herself on the girl for her humiliation and insults, watched this with no less pleasure. Meanwhile, the mother ordered her daughter to go to her room, wishing that these would not be difficult and emotionally charged scenes for her. But the girl, already imagining herself as a duchess, said that she needed to learn how to deal properly with criminals and subordinates. Therefore, Lady Flora also wanted to observe what exactly would happen to Grace and understand how others acted in difficult situations. Meanwhile, the Duchess said that the Duke was so blinded by her beauty that he didn't even notice how she was warming a poisonous snake on her chest. After that, she threw the notes that the girls had written before their deaths to the girl before her death, leaving a final message. As expected, in those notes, all the blame fell on Grace again. And in addition, according to the maids, she asked for the keys to the Duchess's jewelry room. Upon hearing this news, Lady Flora could not stand it because she considered it unacceptable that the girl had first taken the lives of her maids and then demanded the keys. When Flora asked why she followed the Duke, Grace calmly replied that she simply loved him, not hiding her feelings. After that, the Marquise joined the conversation, saying that she had suspected her from the very beginning. Holding Grace by the chin, the Marquise accused her of being one of the invisibles involved in all the crimes. And it was at this moment that Grace realized what the true goal of the Marquise Rinko was, and why all the events had such a tragic sequence. After all, those who attempted to assassinate Prince Ares and those who killed the Dukes of Richmond and Taylor were precisely the Invisibles, and the Empress herself declared them traitors to the state, finally confirming their guilt and sentencing them to punishment. Meanwhile, the Marquise continued to finish off the girl, trying to break her will and force her to confess everything. But the girl held her ground quite firmly, despite the place she was in, and the psychological pressure being exerted on her. And of course, after another response from the girl, the woman couldn't stand it and slapped her, showing her anger and impatience. She explained this by saying that the girl had no evidence except her empty words, and her testimony meant nothing. After that, the woman ordered to find the maid Grace, and to lock Grace herself in a dungeon, depriving her of any possibility of escape. And she started saying again that no one in their right mind would come out of this place trying to intimidate the girl. The Marquise was sure that 3 days would be enough for the girl to lose her mind and tell all the secrets that worried her. After that, the girl was finally left alone in a confined space where not a single ray of light penetrates, where even her breathing echoes. Only being here did Grace realize that the words that no one left here in their right mind were not an exaggeration. But Grace wasn't going to give up so easily and believed she could endure this too, maintaining her will and determination. And of course, Walter also gave her the strength to keep going, supporting her morale, and helping her not to lose heart. She remembered that on the day she first encountered the abyss where everything collapses, she survived only because of the memory of the Crown Prince. And that meant that her darkness was nothing to her because she had learned to draw strength from even the most terrible circumstances. After a while, everyone was looking for Grace's maid, Jessica, who had disappeared without a trace, leaving only speculation and worry. Walter was uncomfortable listening to all this, so he ordered Joseph to lead him to where the bodies of the maids lay, hiding his emotions. Suddenly, one of the wards announced that a terrible disaster had occurred, namely, that His Grace was now approaching them, and after a while a man entered the room, eager to see the bodies of the maids. The man of the Rinko family asked with a satisfied face why he was here, not hiding his curiosity and dominance. And at that moment, Walter saw 2 motionless bodies covered with a sheet and realized that the news about what had happened to the maids was true.